As China's global influence continues to grow, the tensions between China and many countries are growing too. The global perception of China has shifted, leading to tighter restrictions and increasing hostility toward Chinese nationals abroad. Political conflicts, such as the U.S. China trade war, border disputes with neighboring nations, and Beijing's handling of issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan, have escalated these tensions. As a result, many countries have become less welcoming to Chinese citizens, implementing policies that restrict their movement or subject them to increased scrutiny. In this video, we'll explore the top 10 countries where Chinese nationals are not welcome. 1. United States. Anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States has risen sharply in recent years, driven by geopolitical competition, economic rivalry, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The U.S. China trade war that began in 2018 amplified perceptions of China as a threat to American jobs and economic stability. Political rhetoric, particularly under the Trump administration, frequently depicted China as an adversary, fueling distrust and suspicion of Chinese nationals. Chinese students and researchers, in particular, have faced increased scrutiny, with concerns over intellectual property theft and espionage leading to tighter restrictions and visa cancellations. The pandemic further inflamed anti-Chinese sentiment, with many Chinese nationals and Asian Americans being unfairly blamed for the virus's spread, resulting in a sharp rise in hate crimes and racist incidents targeting individuals of Chinese or East Asian descent. Public figures and media outlets often reinforced the narrative that China was responsible for the global crisis, exacerbating xenophobic attitudes. Chinese tourists, students, and immigrants in the U.S. report facing verbal harassment, racial slurs, and even physical violence in some cases. The combination of economic rivalry, geopolitical tension, and pandemic-related fears has created a climate of hostility, making the U.S. a challenging environment for many Chinese nationals. 2. India. India's relationship with China is defined by deep-rooted geopolitical tensions, particularly over their contested border regions. These disputes have fueled mistrust and hostility for decades, with military confrontations along the border periodically escalating tensions. The situation reached a critical point in 2020 when a deadly clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers in the Galwan Valley led to numerous casualties, sparking outrage across India. This event intensified anti-Chinese sentiment to unprecedented levels, with Indian citizens staging protests, boycotting Chinese goods, and demanding a severing of economic ties. The Indian government responded by banning dozens of Chinese apps, including popular platforms like TikTok, as part of a broader strategy to reduce China's influence in the country. Chinese nationals in India, particularly tourists, businesspeople, and students, have reported feeling increasingly unsafe due to the growing wave of nationalism and xenophobia. Incidents of verbal abuse, social exclusion, and even physical altercations have been reported, making India one of the most challenging countries for Chinese nationals. The combination of political conflict, military tension, and pandemic-related fear has created a highly unwelcoming environment for Chinese individuals in India. 3. United Kingdom. In recent years, the United Kingdom has seen a noticeable rise in anti-Chinese sentiment, driven by a combination of political tensions and concerns over Chinese influence. The strained relationship between the UK and China, particularly following the Hong Kong protests and China's increasing assertiveness on the global stage, has contributed to a growing wariness of Chinese nationals. The UK government's decision to offer a pathway to citizenship for Hong Kong residents in response to China's tightening grip on the city further heightened tensions. Chinese students and businesspeople, once welcomed for their contributions to the UK economy and education system, now face an environment marked by suspicion and scrutiny. The UK's media has also played a role in amplifying negative perceptions, often focusing on stories related to espionage, technological threats, or China's role in global health crises. Additionally, political rhetoric around 5G and Huawei has raised concerns about Chinese influence in the UK's infrastructure and technology sectors. As a result, Chinese nationals in the UK often feel unwelcome and find themselves navigating a complex environment where political tensions, media portrayals, and pandemic-related fears have created a sense of alienation and hostility. 4. Japan. Japan's strained relationship with China, rooted in centuries of historical tension, still heavily influences how Chinese nationals are received in the country today. While Japan remains one of the most popular destinations for Chinese tourists, many report experiencing subtle forms of discrimination. Japanese society is often viewed as insular, and Chinese tourists are frequently stereotyped as loud, disrespectful, and unruly in public spaces. These perceptions are reinforced by Japanese media, which has highlighted incidents involving Chinese tourists in popular destinations like Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka, resulting in protests and a general wariness toward Chinese visitors. The resentment isn't limited to tourists. Chinese residents and students often struggle to integrate into Japanese society, facing barriers related to language, culture, and social norms. This sense of exclusion can be particularly strong in smaller communities, where foreigners are even less accepted. Though Japan maintains an outwardly polite and respectful demeanor, these underlying tensions manifest in ways that leave Chinese nationals feeling unwelcome and marginalized. The combination of cultural isolation, historical grievances, and negative stereotyping contributes to an overall chilly reception for Chinese people in Japan. 5. The Philippines. In the Philippines, rising tensions over territorial disputes in the South China Sea have fueled a surge of anti-Chinese sentiment. The conflict over areas such as the Scarborough Shoal and the Spratly Islands has led many Filipinos to view China as an aggressive power seeking to dominate the region. This geopolitical struggle has translated into growing resentment toward Chinese nationals, both tourists and residents. Anti-China protests are a frequent occurrence in the Philippines, with demonstrators expressing their discontent over China's expansive claims in the region. These protests often spill over into broader anti-Chinese rhetoric, with Filipinos blaming Chinese nationals for a range of issues, from economic domination to environmental degradation caused by Chinese-backed projects. The COVID-19 pandemic further intensified these sentiments, as some Filipinos blamed China for the spread of the virus. Reports of Chinese nationals being harassed or discriminated against in public spaces became more common during the height of the pandemic. Additionally, Chinese businesses and investors are sometimes seen as taking opportunities away from locals, contributing to economic frustrations. Although the Philippine government maintains diplomatic ties with China, the public perception remains largely negative, creating an environment where Chinese nationals often feel unwelcome and targeted by nationalist rhetoric. 6. South Korea. In South Korea, Chinese nationals encounter growing hostility driven by historical tensions, economic competition, and political disputes. Chinese visitors are often stereotyped as loud or inconsiderate, which has sparked discontent among South Koreans, especially in popular tourist destinations like Seoul and Jeju Island. Moreover, accusations of cultural appropriation, such as China claiming Korean cultural symbols like kimchi or hanbok, have fueled further resentment. While South Korea remains a top destination for Chinese tourists and students, the subtle yet widespread sense of exclusion persists. Chinese nationals frequently report feeling unwelcome, from receiving subpar service in stores and restaurants to experiencing general coldness in social interactions. This underlying animosity, amplified by nationalistic rhetoric and media coverage, has left many Chinese visitors and residents feeling alienated in a country with which they share much cultural and historical exchange. 7. Malaysia. Malaysia has a complex relationship with its ethnic Chinese population, which makes it challenging for Chinese nationals to feel fully accepted. Ethnic Chinese Malaysians, who constitute about a quarter of the population, have historically faced systemic discrimination through policies favoring the ethnic Malay majority. These tensions often spill over to Chinese tourists and expatriates, who are viewed with suspicion by segments of the Malaysian population. China's increasing economic presence in Malaysia, particularly through investments in infrastructure and real estate, has sparked fears that the country is becoming overly reliant on Chinese capital. Some Malaysians believe that Chinese nationals are driving up property prices and benefiting from government projects at the expense of locals. The COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbated these concerns, with reports of discrimination against Chinese nationals becoming more frequent. Chinese tourists were often unfairly blamed for spreading the virus, leading to incidents of verbal abuse and mistreatment in public spaces. Additionally, the Belt and Road Initiative has sparked debates about Malaysia's sovereignty, with critics arguing that the country is becoming economically subservient to China. As a result, many Chinese nationals in Malaysia find themselves navigating an environment where they are viewed with a mixture of distrust, resentment, and, at times, hostility. 8. Indonesia. Indonesia has a long and troubled history regarding its ethnic Chinese population, and this hostility often extends to Chinese nationals. In 1998, anti-Chinese riots swept through the country, targeting ethnic Chinese Indonesians in response to economic hardships. This historical animosity continues to influence how Chinese people are perceived in Indonesia today. Many Indonesians harbor resentment toward Chinese businesses, particularly in sectors like mining and infrastructure, where Chinese companies are accused of exploiting local resources and labor. Chinese nationals involved in these industries are often viewed as part of a broader economic invasion, which stokes nationalist and protectionist sentiments. Moreover, China's growing influence in Indonesia, through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, has fueled fears that China is trying to dominate the Indonesian economy, leading to greater distrust of Chinese nationals. While Indonesia remains an important partner for China, particularly in terms of trade and investment, the social and cultural environment is often unwelcoming for Chinese nationals, who face both historical prejudices and modern-day economic rivalries. 9. Vietnam. Vietnam has a long history of conflict with China, from ancient wars to modern territorial disputes, most notably in the South China Sea. This complex relationship has fostered deep-rooted anti-Chinese sentiment among the Vietnamese public. Chinese tourists and businesses in Vietnam often find themselves the targets of hostility, with locals viewing China's growing economic influence in the region as a threat to Vietnamese sovereignty. Protests against Chinese actions in the South China Sea are common, and nationalist sentiments flare up in response to any perceived encroachments by China. Chinese businesses, especially in industries like construction and mining, are often accused of exploiting local resources, fueling resentment toward Chinese nationals working or investing in Vietnam. Moreover, Vietnam's historical grievances, such as the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, continue to influence public perceptions of China, painting it as an aggressor. This hostility has occasionally escalated into violence, with anti-Chinese riots breaking out in 2014, targeting Chinese-owned factories and businesses. While physical attacks have become rarer, the atmosphere remains tense, and many Chinese nationals living or traveling in Vietnam report feeling unwelcome or viewed with suspicion. The combination of historical animosity, economic competition, and nationalist fervor ensures that anti-Chinese sentiment remains a persistent issue in Vietnam. 10. Australia. Once a highly sought-after destination for Chinese immigrants, tourists, and students, has seen a significant rise in anti-Chinese sentiment in recent years. The tension is driven by Australia's growing concerns about China's influence in its domestic affairs, particularly regarding foreign investments, property ownership, and alleged political interference. The strained diplomatic relationship, worsened by trade disputes and concerns over espionage, has created an environment where many Australians view Chinese nationals with suspicion. The COVID-19 pandemic heightened these tensions further, with reports of racial abuse, harassment, and even violent attacks targeting Chinese Australians and international students. Chinese nationals in Australia often face subtle forms of discrimination, such as being ostracized in public spaces or experiencing hostility in universities. Chinese businesses have also come under scrutiny, with accusations that they are driving up housing prices and monopolizing certain industries. Despite Australia's reputation as a multicultural nation, many Chinese nationals feel marginalized and scapegoated for broader geopolitical issues. Media portrayals of China's global policies, particularly regarding Hong Kong and the South China Sea,